Hello, scholars. Welcome back. Mr. Long here. Today, for our U.S. history class, we're going to be talking a little bit about the American Revolution, or at least roughly the first half of it. Here's our agenda for today. We're going to be looking at a quick review of the causes of the American Revolution. We're going to be comparing and contrasting the two sides between the colonists and the British. We're going to take a look at the Battle of Trenton, the Battle of Saratoga, wintering at Valley Forge, take a very brief look at governing the colonies during the war, and then touch on a few things that we're going to be looking at in the next couple of lessons. So to review some of the causes for the American Revolution, these are some of the big things that I need you guys to be familiar with moving forward. First one is the end of the French and Indian War. The three main things coming out of that war that we need to be aware of. One, no more French in North America. When the French were occupying Canada and Louisiana, the colonists had a healthy level of fear that the French would come down and invade or raid, or at least provide a threat to the colonists. The fear of that threat is going to do a lot to keep the colonists loyal to the British as they look up at the British as if they're their older brother protecting them on a playground from another bully. Once the French are gone and that threat is removed, the colonists no longer have that relationship with England, or at least not in the same way. And so removing the French from North America is going to start to change the way the colonists look at themselves and their relationship with Great Britain here in the New World. Second one, British government's debt doubled from the war. Money is going to be a big part of the outbreak for the American Revolution. And something we've probably all heard in passing, even if it's half joking, is no taxation without representation. And so this debt here is going to very much tie into the taxation issues with the colonists later on. The last one is the Proclamation of 1763. The Proclamation of 1763, for those of you who maybe need a little bit of a refresher, this was an order from the British Parliament telling the colonists they cannot go west of the Appalachian Mountains and the Allegheny Mountains. They are not allowed to go over the mountains into new territory that the colonists felt that they had earned as a result of their efforts during the French and Indian War. This is largely a response to Pontiac's rebellion after the French and Indian War, because the British do not want the colonists venturing over the mountains, getting into conflicts with the Native Americans that then might break out into a full-scale war, like we saw with Pontiac's rebellion. And so they're trying to keep the colonists contained, and the colonists are not going to do very well at being told no. So that's one of the other things we need to keep in mind. Quartering Act of 1765. The Quartering Act of 1765, this was where the British Parliament pretty much told the Americans that they would be responsible for housing and feeding British soldiers that were in North America, that were there to protect the colonists from Native Americans after Pontiac's rebellion, or also just keeping the peace. The reason the Americans are going to be asked to pay for the housing and feeding of the soldiers is money. Money is what makes the world go round. And the British government, as a result of being pushed so far in debt from the American, or not the American Revolution, from the French and Indian War, they're trying to find ways to pinch pennies and push some of their financial burden onto their loyal subjects, the colonists. Taking us to taxation. Two of the main taxes that we should be familiar with are the stamp tax of 1765 and the tea tax of 1773. The stamp tax of 1765 was the first major tax that the colonists were forced to endure. We say major tax compared to the British in Great Britain. The stamp tax was pretty minimal. It wasn't very big compared to what the British subjects were already paying, but because the American colonists didn't really have any experience with direct taxation, it seemed really scary and new, and so they're going to push back very hard against it. They're going to boycott British goods, start to have protests, and the British government is going to repeal the stamp tax after the successful protest from the colonists. The other tax that we should be familiar with is the tea tax. This is the one that's going to get a lot of Americans in trouble. Tea tax, the American colonists as loyal British subjects really love their tea, and so they took this one pretty close home. So be familiar with the tea tax. Again, it's just a tax on pretty much tea. Nothing really complicated about it, but it's a thing that almost every American colonist drank at least once or twice a day. And so it really added up, especially psychologically in the eyes of the colonists that were having to pay this tax. Boston, Massachusetts. Boston, Massachusetts is going to be a hotbed of revolutionary fervor. They are going to be pretty much the birthplace of revolution. The first key instance we have is the Boston Massacre of 1770. This was the story that we talked about where some British soldiers guarding the customs house were assaulted by a mob, and they fired their muskets into the mob, killing a couple of Bostonians. And the American, the colonial propaganda, the Sons of Liberty, they're really going to run away with this. And we looked at an etching from Paul Revere as he's trying to illustrate and stir up the people against the British using this incident as an example. The Boston Tea Party, if you're looking at the years here, this is going to happen right after the tea tax. This was a not so peaceful protest by the Sons of Liberty as they boarded a British ship and just started throwing tea into the harbor as a protest to what they saw as an unjust tax. Because again, they weren't represented in Parliament, so they saw it as unfair and unlawful. The British government is going to respond to the Boston Tea Party by sending more troops to Boston, further making things a little stressful for everybody, but also with the Boston Port Bill of 1774. What the Boston Port Bill is going to do is it's going to close down Boston Harbor for trade. And what they're attempting to do is starve out the Bostonians financially, not letting them trade, so that they would kind of learn a lesson from misbehaving like an unruly child. This is going to further escalate as we get closer and closer to Lexington and Concord, and finally the outbreak of the American Revolution. So as war begins following Lexington and Concord, both sides start to figure out what they're going to do and how they're going to operate during this war. Let's take a quick look at some of the strengths and weaknesses of both sides. For the American colonists, one of their most important advantages is their home field advantage. They know the terrain, they know how to get where they need to go, whereas the British, who are unfamiliar with the terrain because their soldiers and generals don't live and work in the parts of America that these wars are going to be fought in, they're going to be at a disadvantage. American leadership, in general, is going to be pretty good. We're going to get some excellent military leaders like George Washington, although tactically not brilliant. His ability to keep the army together and listen to the advice of his staff are going to set him above many of the British generals of the time. The British, they are sending, in large part, their second tier or their junior varsity leaders. There are some high-ranking generals coming over from the British. However, the British aren't always sending their best and brightest because they're worried about insurrections in Ireland, which is far closer to home than England than the American colonies are. So the Americans are able to put their varsity team in the field, at least leadership-wise, while the British are often working with their JV or maybe a few of their varsity guys. The American colonists are also strongly motivated. They are fighting for their homeland. They are fighting for their freedom, at least that propaganda sense coming in. And they're going to try to outlast the British, or at least try harder than the British because they have more to gain. The British, on the other hand, they're not as motivated. They are fighting far from home, which is going to be a logistical issue because they have to ship their soldiers and supplies across the entire ocean, where John Smith, American colonist, can just go out of his backyard and pretty much walk to the battle that he needs to go fight in. The British soldiers typically aren't overly motivated. They're not looking to die in this war. They don't see the sacrifice as necessary, whereas many of the colonists, they're willing to risk their lives for something that they feel is worth dying for. So tying it back to motivation. For weaknesses for the American colonists, most of the American colonists are untrained and undisciplined. They're not used to the traditional warfare that the British employ. They're not well trained in musketry or marching or bayonet charges, at least at first. They're going to get better at it with time, but in the beginning, they're mostly just a rabble of farmers who don't really know what they're doing. The Americans are also lacking supplies. They don't have an industrial base, so finding ammunition and muskets are not going to be easy to come across. Also, common things like boots, blankets, things that the colonists are going to need to wage a war, they don't have ready access to, whereas the British, they're able to be resupplied, albeit from all the way across an ocean, but they're at least able to get the supplies that they need to fight the war. The Americans also lack a navy, so the British are going to control the seas at least until France gets involved. And the Americans also lack a central government. And we'll talk about lacking a central government more at the end of this video. For the British Empire, they have a strong, experienced, and trained army. These are the guys that just beat the French during the French and Indian War, so they kind of know what they're doing. The British also have a strong central government, so they're able to provide funding and guidance for the generals waging the war. They also have the support of loyalists and Native Americans. Something I want to bring to your attention here are the loyalists. Typically, when we look at the population of the American colonists during the American Revolution, not all the Americans are going to support the revolution. Instead, we get about 1/3 of them are going to be fighting on the side of the patriots or the revolutionaries. 1/3 of them are going to be fighting alongside the British, and then you have 1/3 who just really don't care. They're not overly concerned. It doesn't matter to them which flag is flying over their local courthouse or the Capitol. As long as they're able to go farm and go about their daily business, the winner of the war doesn't necessarily matter. So in general, the colonists and the patriots that are waging the war against the British Empire are, for the duration of the war, the minority. They do not make up more than 50% of all the colonists themselves. We already talked about some of these weaknesses for the British. Fighting far from home logistically is going to be a burden. They're unfamiliar with the terrain, so strategically that's going to be an issue. Second-tier leaders. And they also are going to lack support from home. And this is going to tie into the motivation bit I was mentioning before. Now, they have financial and logistical support. They are able to get supplies, but most of the British citizens back home in England, they don't really care about the colonists. They don't really see this as a necessary war, and they're not going to advocate for a prolonged war. Many of these advantages and disadvantages are going to be similar to what we're going to see when we eventually get to the Vietnam War, except flipped. Whereas the British Empire here are going to have a very similar situation as the Americans during the Vietnam War, and North Vietnam and the Viet Cong are going to be serving as the American colonist versus the American government during the Vietnam War. Couple key engagements that I want to talk about today. First one is the Battle of Trenton. Some of you may be familiar with this well-known painting of George Washington crossing the Delaware. This is the painting of George Washington leading his troops on their way across the frozen river to attack the British and Hessian forces at Trenton. For the timeline over here, you can see there's a whole lot of stuff going on. And there you are. I'm just nitpicking a couple battles to talk about in the entire duration of the war. The timeline here goes from 1775 with Lexington and Concord all the way until the Treaty of Paris. So there's a lot of stuff going on during this time. I just want to talk about a couple key events. Battle of Trenton. If you're looking at the timeline, the colonists, after the British arrived in Boston, where are you? So after the British leave Boston, right around here, the British retreat and the Americans have an early victory. But the British Empire strikes back, and they return in force, and they land around New York City, and the colonists are going to have a pretty bad time. And so from summer all the way through fall of 1776, the American colonists are on the retreat. They are not doing well. And people are starting to think that perhaps going to war against Great Britain wasn't worth it, and this is a lost cause. George Washington decides to make a sneak attack against some British and Hessian forces the day after Christmas when they're all partied out and try to catch them by surprise. So he rows his army across the frozen river. They attack the Hessians and the British, and they are able to claim victory. Now, the victory itself isn't strategic in any sense other than just getting a victory, but it was a victory when the American military was at one of its lowest points, or at least the colonial military was at its lowest points. And being able to secure that victory is going to breathe new life into the revolution and see it through the rest of that winter. So again, Washington, from the darkest time of the American Revolution, is able to keep the army together and keep the war, or keep the colonists in the war, so that they can continue to wage the war moving forward and maybe draw something out of the British. The second battle I want to talk about here is the Battle of Saratoga. This is going to be an American victory up in like the New York, Great Lakes area. This is commonly referred to as the turning point of the war. The Battle of Saratoga is going to see some dramatic shift in strategy from the British. Before Saratoga, the British are able to conduct their military operations inland, away from the ocean. After Saratoga, the British are going to start to focus all of their attacks and their strategy along the East Coast, where they can use their navy as an advantage. Saratoga is also seen as a turning point because it was after this battle that foreign aid is going to start to arrive to the Americans. And it takes the Battle of Saratoga for nations like Prussia or France to think, maybe the Americans can win this war and it's worth investing in, so we're not just throwing guns and money down the drain. Valley Forge. The winner of 1777 and 1778, so many sevens. This is one of a second low point to the American Revolution. For the most part, the Americans had mostly defeats. They had a few, such as Trenton or Saratoga, but more often than not, the American army was being crushed time and time again by the British. The winter itself was a harsh winter, lots of snow. This is a time before highways and trucks, so moving supplies to the army during snow is definitely a challenge. And the Continental Army is starting to run out of food and supplies. Many of the soldiers are going without boots or blankets during a winter, which is not really a fun time. Approximately 2,000 soldiers are going to die from malnutrition or disease or frostbite and just freezing to death. And so the army is truly suffering. And it is here at Valley Forge that the first little bits of foreign aid are going to start to arrive for the army to keep the morale and the men together enough that the army can come out of the winter still intact. A Prussian named von Steuben, he's going to take a leading role. He's going to show up and help train the American colonists in professional warfare. marching in rank and file, loading and firing in unison, marksmanship, discipline. And the army that marches out of Valley Forge in the spring is going to be a radically different army than the one that marched in late fall. While all this is happening, all these battles are raging, we do need to touch a little bit about the politics. The colonies are very much just a collection of independent states at this point. They're only the United States in name. Each colony has their own government, much like how today each state has their own state government. And there is a Continental Congress that is meeting and trying to organize and keep everyone moving in the same direction. But Congress lacks any true power to raise funds, to tax. And if you can't tax people, you don't have money to buy weapons or food. And so Congress is really failing again and again to provide the army with the supplies it needs as well as leadership for the nation as a whole. The Congress is going to try to print paper money, something that we use today without thinking about it. But back during that time, it wasn't very reliable. And the Congress is going to end up printing too much money. And then the money is going to become inflated to the point where it's practically worthless, further making things more difficult for the Continental Congress to supply their troops because their money doesn't really have any value anymore. And it's just going to be a bad situation. Some of the Americans are going to begin profiteering. This is the selling of scarce goods for a profit. For example, if you know the American military needs food and you have apples, and instead of charging 30 cents an apple, now you're going to charge $5 an apple because you know they really need those apples. Those profiteers are going to make a lot of money moving goods that are highly needed just because they're in high demand and trying to take advantage of a situation. Moving forward, over the next couple of lessons, we're going to be looking at the closing of the American Revolution, a couple battles that I don't think we're going to have time to go into any great detail, but are pretty fantastic from a history standpoint. These are the Battle of Camden, the Battle of Kings Mountain, and the Battle of Cowpens in the 1780s. These are some pretty interesting battles, especially for what they meant for the war effort as a whole. Battle of Kings Mountain is a pretty minor one, but if you want to read about just a bunch of mountain men coming over and regrouping to wreak havoc on some loyalists that were doing some shady stuff, that's a pretty cool one. What we are going to focus on instead in class is we're going to be talking about foreign aid to the colonists. These are going to come from two main places, von Steuben, who I mentioned earlier, from Prussia, and a fella named Marquis de Lafayette, who's going to come from France to help the Continental Army, but he's also going to be instrumental in getting supplies from the French government. We're going to look at the end of the war and the Treaty of Paris in 1783. And then after that, we're going to talk about the Articles of Confederation, our government's first real attempt to self-govern. And we're going to see how that's not going to go necessarily according to plan, and how the failure of the Articles is going to bring about the U.S. Constitution, effectively the playbook for the United States government that we still use today, albeit with some amendments. So that's all I have for you guys today. I'm looking forward to seeing you guys next, and keep studying and do good things. Mr. Long, over and out.